He must not have watched enough like crime drama television series or movies. I mean, dude, pull the teeth, set the car on fire.
That's right.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 291. Thank you so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week again this week, and thank you for putting up with a bit of a delay in releasing this episode. We didn't put out an episode last week, partly because of the Thanksgiving holiday, but also because of something stupid that I did. My daughter, I explained this briefly to the members of the Reformation Gun Club, so I'm going to make this this little mea culpa, this explanation, this to you folks. My daughter has wanted a bigger bedroom, and she needs one, and my office was bigger than her bedroom, so we had discussed switching bedrooms or switching rooms so she would have more space. And so over the Thanksgiving week, I was off and I decided, okay, well, we'll go ahead and get this done. We'll move everything. Well, I didn't take into account just how much crap there was to move. All of my stuff for my office was really the worst of it. The moving her stuff was not. All of the little knickknacks and a billion books and all of my computer equipment and recording equipment. And then once I got it all set up, I realized I didn't take time to figure out how to hook up the internet. So I had everything moved and had no internet access in my office, which was a bit of a problem. And I just couldn't get it done in time for both the live online hangout with the Reformation Gun Club, which was supposed to happen last weekend, or time to get this show recorded. So I apologize for the delay, and I'm glad you're here this week, and I'm glad everything's back to normal. We're in the new Armed Lutheran studio, and bringing you this new episode and last night's Reformation Gun Club online hangout which was November's online hangout, which happened in December, but we'll get into that another time. Anyway, speaking of the Reformation Gun Club, I want to thank all of the members for their support for making all of this possible. Reformation Gun Club members, through their monthly and annual donations, help keep the lights on and support the show, and I really do appreciate it. This week, I want to thank Brad from Hartford, Wisconsin, Dallas from Severance, Colorado, Dan from Indian Trail, North Carolina, Daniel from Chehalis, Washington, Kenneth from Sugarland, Texas, Mark from St. Paul, Minnesota, and the disreputable Bartlett. Thank you all so much. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded. That means we don't have any advertising. We don't have any sponsors, so you're not going to hear any advertising during the show except for this little bit of a pitch for the Reformation Gun Club. Members of the Gun Club help support the show. They get some cool benefits like access to our monthly online hangouts, to our cool new website. Well, it's not really new anymore, with hundreds of hours of exclusive content that we release each month. And the wonderful satisfaction of knowing that you helped make all of this possible, and you can be a part of it if you would like to check it all out. Find out about all the benefits for as little as $1 a month, $12 a year. you can become a member and join all these wonderful folks from around the country. Check it out at armedlutheran.us/gun club for all the details, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. All right, what are we doing this week? Well, Pastor Bennett is hip deep in basketball tournaments and Advent services and all of that good stuff. So I am flying solo today, and I wanted to comment on something that happened this week, referring back to something we discussed in episode 286. Back in that episode, I talked about loving our enemies, praying for our enemies, even people like Alec Baldwin. And at the time, Baldwin had just been involved in an on-set firearms accident, which resulted in the shooting of the director and lead cinematographer for a movie called Rust, which he was working on. A gun went off on set and killed the cinematographer, Halyna Hutchins. I terribly mispronounced her first name in episode 286. My apologies. It is Halyna Hutchins, and then, of course, wounded that same shot injured. I can't remember the guy's name. The director of the movie, and this was a gun. This was a round fired from a gun held by actor Alec Baldwin. And at the time, we didn't have a full picture of what had happened on the set. And I was encouraging people to slow down, not jump to conclusions. I know a lot of people were ridiculing Baldwin simply because he is anti-gun. And I pointed out, look, there's somebody's wounded, a young woman is dead. There are a lot of people grieving, including Baldwin himself, because he had done something that you and I and most gun owners will never do, and that is he shot and killed someone with a firearm. So this week, we've got a lot more information now. We know a lot more about what happened since then. And this week, ABC and the diminutive George Stephanopoulos did what I think is a grave disservice to the memory of Halyna Hutchins and her loved ones by airing, to put it charitably, an incredibly self-serving interview with Alec Baldwin, where he refused to take any responsibility for her death, and he blamed others, and he made some rather interesting claims about what actually happened and gave us some details that I think are crucial to understanding what did happen that day. As I said back in episode 286, we didn't know much. We need to wait for more details. Well, we've got more details now. So in case you have not seen this interview, and based on a lot of the responses to this interview, I'm going to guess most people have not actually taken the time to watch it, and they're only responding to what they've seen written about it. So I'm going to give you, first off, before I get into the details and we break this thing down, I want to give you my overall impression of Mr. Baldwin in this interview. I actually believed him. For much of what he said, I believed what he was saying. I don't think this was scripted. I don't think he was acting. I don't think that the tears and the emotional moments were fake. I think he is an incredibly narcissistic guy, and that came through, but I think he's also grieving and having some real difficulty with this, and he doesn't want to accept responsibility that clearly should fall on his head. But I believed much of what he said. I think a lot of the reaction, like I said, to this interview is based on reacting to excerpts from the interview and not on the whole interview in full context. A lot of people are pounding him for saying that he didn't pull the trigger. The internet has gone crazy on that comment alone. And I think they're doing the same stupid thing that the left does after a mass shooting. They're jumping to conclusions based on limited info or when taking a quote out of context. I mean, people don't like Alec Baldwin. People on our side don't like him. And it's easy to immediately jump on something that sounds false and to accuse him of lying. And I've seen a lot of people, including some very prominent members of the entertainment world, who have made fun of his claim that he didn't pull the trigger. I'm going to tell you right now, those people did not listen to the interview when they reacted to this. And if they had, they would shut the hell up. Because I think it's easy for us to dismiss people we don't like, to dismiss the things that someone says if we don't like the person who's saying it. But if you set that aside and you take the time to actually listen and watch dispassionately, which I did, I tried to set aside the fact that I don't like Alec Baldwin or his politics, and I tried to just focus on what he was saying and whether or not it's believable. It's narcissistic, it's self-serving, but it's believable. So hear me out. We're going to go through some of these points, and I'll explain in greater detail why I say this. Now, he says at one point in the interview that it's it's important that he not come across in this interview as a victim. But at the very beginning, when Stephanopoulos asks him why he's doing the interview, he says, well, I think there's a criminal investigation, and that could be a while. There's all kinds of civil litigation, and I felt there were a number of misconceptions, most from sources I wouldn't really concern myself about, but a couple that I did concern myself about, where there were these authoritative statements of this is what happened. The sheriff's department hasn't released a report to the DA yet. And the reason I wanted to sit down with you, Stephanopoulos, is because I really feel like I can't wait for that process to end in February or March. So, and then he says, I'm not asking them to speed up the investigation for myself, but that's exactly what he wants. He's saying he can't wait to get this story out. He wants to shift the blame before, in the public's eye, before the investigation actually finds him at fault. He doesn't want to sound like the victim, but he wants to take advantage of this, or get in front of this thing so that he doesn't take any blame. He says, and then a few minutes later, in one of the points where the crying kind of got to me, he broke down. At one point, after saying he doesn't want to be perceived as a victim, he starts crying at one point because working on this movie made him kind of fall in love with movie making again. And now, oh, woe is me, because I'm finally on this wonderful project. This terrible thing happens and it's destroyed it all. Cry me a river. So let's get past that part of it and get down to the nitty-gritty of what actually happened that day. Now, he says at one point, the second thing is that of all what happened on that day leading up to this event was precipitated on one idea, that is that Halyna and I had something profound in common. And that we both assumed the gun was empty other than those dummy rounds. Now, that last part of that sentence, we both assumed the gun was empty other than those dummy rounds. So he was handed a gun. We now know from his own mouth, he was handed a gun with rounds in it. And the rounds were, he assumed, and everyone else assumed, were inert. They were dummy rounds, he thought. That's key. That's important. We're not talking about a gun that was empty and, oh, oops, we had one round in one of the chambers. No, he was handed a gun with 6 rounds in it, and everyone on the set assumed that they were all dummy rounds. So he describes the scene. Here's the scene that they were practicing for when the shooting took place. The scene, quote, the scene is 2 guys are there who have got me cornered, and they think I'm shot up pretty bad, and I'm wilting, and they have a gun, and then a sound outside distracts them, and I would then draw the gun across, a cross draw out of my holster, pull the gun up like that, and he points with his fingers, and start to cock the pistol and cut. I'm handed this gun by someone who declares this is a cold gun. Now, there are a couple of important bits there to consider. First, this scene called for him to draw a gun out of a cross-draw holster. Now, cross-draw, for those who don't know the term, think of that classic image of Val Kilmer from Tombstone, the I'm Your Huckleberry scene, and he's got that pearl-handled revolver in a cross-draw position, in a cross-draw holster on his left side, and he reaches across with his right hand to draw it. The way this works, cross-draw means that the holster is on the opposite side from your dominant shooting hand. It's not on if you're right-handed, normally a strong side or, holster will be right below your hand, will be on your belt, on the side, same side as your strong hand, the hand you're going to shoot with. If the gun is in a cross-draw holster, it's all the way on the other side. And it's tilted, canted, so that the grip is easier to grasp. You reach across your body with your shooting hand, you grip it, and then draw the gun out. The problem is, and what makes this dangerous, is that to draw that gun out and point it forward towards the target, you have to muzzle pretty much everybody in the room. The gun has to traverse a rather wide arc. Take your right hand, if you're right-handed or your left hand, whatever. I'm just going to assume most of you are right-handed because I am, and it would be easier for me to describe this way. Take your right hand and bend it and put your hand on your chest. Okay? Now tilt your arm, swing your arm forward so your fingers are pointing away from you, directly away from you. Tilt your arm, bend your arm so that now you're pointing forward like you were pointing a gun down range. Now look at all of that arc that your hand covers as you move from left to right to point the gun. If the gun's in your hand, you're muzzling a whole bunch of stuff that you have no intention of shooting before the gun actually comes to rest at the position that you want it to be in when you're going to fire. Unlike that strong side holster I talked about, where all you have to do is grab the gun, pull up, and then rotate the gun towards the target. In this case, it's a dangerous, or at the very least, more challenging method of carry and a more challenging draw stroke to get the gun out of the holster and oriented towards the target without pointing that gun at something that you don't want to shoot. It's practically impossible. Now, the term cold gun. Baldwin explains, quote, "In my years on the sets of film, hot gun meant that there was a charge in there, and cold gun meant there was nothing in there. When he's saying this is a cold gun, what he's saying to everyone on the set is, you can relax. The gun is empty. Cold gun means there's no charge in there. Now, there could be dummy rounds," end quote. So cold gun means either a completely empty gun or a gun with dummy rounds in it. So he's told, that this is a cold gun. This is a gun that will not fire. Now, as he admitted earlier, as I just mentioned, when he says, we both assumed the gun was empty other than those dummy rounds, he was handed a gun that contained what he thought were dummy rounds, inert cartridges that give you the impression that the gun is loaded. This is important really only if you're talking about a revolver, where you can actually see down in the chambers of the cylinder, and you could actually see the end of the bullets if you're pointing the gun toward the camera. And if that's if it's empty, it's obvious because it's just an empty black hole. If it's a blank, then the end of the bullet, the end of the cartridge looks different. It's kind of crimped. There's no bullet there. And so to make that illusion that the gun is actually loaded, you put these dummy rounds in that have no powder, no primer, so that when the trigger is pulled, the bullet won't fire. So we've got a gun with rounds in it that they thought were dummies, and we've got this cross-draw holster that requires him to sweep half the room as he pulls the gun out. Now, as I suspected was the case, this wasn't just him goofing off. This wasn't actually them filming anything. Baldwin described this as what is called a marking rehearsal, where the actors are actually walking through the scene and the directors are framing the shots and marking where the actors should stand, where they should look, where they should point their firearms, so they get the shot with the camera that they want. So, and what Baldwin says next is very critical, and you'll miss it unless you watch. You have to actually, if you hear him describe it, you don't get the sense of what's going on. You have to watch this to really get it. Baldwin says, this is a marking rehearsal where I'm going to show her, that's Halyna Hutchins, she's standing next to the camera. She's like this, you and me. You're me, he says to Stephanopoulos. She's got the monitor here. The camera is here filming that way. She takes a monitor that is... she takes a monitor monitor the operator and turns it towards her. It swivels and she says to me, hold the gun lower, go to your right. Okay, right there. All right, do that. Now show it a little bit lower. And she's getting me to position the gun. Now, you can't get from that quote, you can't really get a sense of what he's describing. He is showing Stephanopoulos where he is in relation to Hutchins. And based on his demonstration, if you watch the video, the motion of his cross draw had to have swept her to get the gun to the camera. She is sitting in front of him at basically perpendicular to him. She's facing... her right-hand side is facing him, essentially. And she's looking into the monitor, and the camera's pointing at Baldwin. So Baldwin has to draw the gun out, sweep it across her to get to the camera. All right? So this is something that you won't get unless you watch the video, watch the interview. And next he says something that is really important in relation to this claim that he did not pull the trigger. And if you only read all the anti-Baldwin media posts about his claim that he didn't pull the trigger, you would miss this. This is important. He says, quote, everything is in her direction. She's guiding me through how she wants me to hold the gun for this angle. And I draw the gun out, and I find a mark. I draw the gun out, cut. And that's really urgent. And what's really urgent is the gun wasn't meant to be fired in that angle. So what he's saying is this is a dry run to draw the gun out, find the perfect spot to point it, to mark it for the camera when they actually do start filming. They're not filming at this point. They never intended for him to actually fire the gun. All they wanted him to do was to draw it and present it and then cut. They're going to stop. Listen to this next exchange. This is crucial. Stephanopoulos says, so you're shooting directly into the camera lens. You're not aiming. And Baldwin says, I'm not shooting into the camera lens. I'm shooting just off. Stephanopoulos says, just off? And Baldwin responds, right, in her direction. I'm holding the gun where she told me to hold it, which ended up being aimed right below her armpit. That's stunning right there. He admits he's pointing the gun directly at her. Now she is facing, if you picture this, she's seated facing this view screen for the camera, and to her right is Baldwin, who's pulled the gun out, swept her with it, and pointed it at her armpit, essentially. This was a completely incidental shot, Baldwin said, an angle that may not have ended up in the film at all, but we kept doing this. So I said to her, now in this scene, I'm going to go to the gun, and I said, do you want to see that? And she said, yes. So I take the gun out, and I start to cock the gun. I'm not going to pull the trigger, end quote. So we've got a gun loaded with bullets that they thought were dummies. We've got this questionable cross draw that sweeps Miss Hutchins and points the gun right at her armpit. And then he cocks the gun to show her how it looks. You see where this is going? Now we get to the I didn't pull the trigger claim. And I think he's telling the truth about this. And here's why. Yes, guns don't go off by themselves. You do have to pull the trigger and all that. I mean, that's for a modern firearm, that is absolutely true. But what we're talking about here is what I believe I read is a Pieta reproduction of a Colt single action revolver. And if it's a faithful reproduction, then it can fire without pulling the trigger. Listen to this, and I'll explain. Baldwin tells Stephanopoulos that he pulled back the hammer and he positioned the gun with Hutchins' direction where she told him to point it, and then, quote, I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off. I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off. That was the moment the gun went off. And Stephanopoulos says, it wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled. And Baldwin says, well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger. He didn't have to. I believe this. Based on this description of what he says happened, I absolutely believe this. He dropped the hammer. Now, like I said, if this is a faithful reproduction of a Colt single action, there's no transfer bar to prevent the firing pin from actually striking the primer of a live round. If you drop the hammer, the firing pin's going to poke through the frame, strike the primer of the round that's in the chamber, and it's going to go off. So if he dropped the hammer with enough force, and it probably wouldn't take much. If you've ever watched, go watch, I think it's Hickok 45, where he does some of his shows. He's got a couple of episodes, maybe more than a couple, where he talks about the Colt Single Action Army, and he never loads more than 5 rounds so that he can rest the hammer, so that he can holster the gun with the hammer down on an empty chamber, because it's too easy to bump the hammer and set a round off, maybe into your leg or your foot. So, if this is a faithful reproduction, and he dropped the hammer with enough force, and like I said, it probably wouldn't take much, and there was a live round in the chamber, and obviously there was, you don't need to pull the trigger. Based on this description, I believe him, and I believe that's what happened. So Dave and Dave Halls, who is the first assistant director, the first AD on the film, was the guy who handed the gun to Baldwin and told him it was a cold gun. He said in a statement from his attorney that he was watching when this happened and Baldwin did not pull the trigger. Stephanopoulos asks him, "So you never pulled the trigger?" No, Baldwin says. "I would never point a gun at anyone and pull the trigger. That was the training I had. You don't point a gun at me and pull the trigger." All right, so now this is where things get a little bit murky, and he starts to prevaricate a little bit. He claims that his training was that you never point a gun at anyone and pull the trigger. But as he just admitted a few minutes earlier, he did in fact point the gun at Hutchins, and he pulled the hammer back and let it fall. That's basically the same thing. And if you don't know that, then you've been really poorly trained in firearms. So this is where the blame shifting really gets started and gets kicked off, and the safety issues really become clear here. Stephanopoulos brings up all the criticisms of the safety protocols, the argument that Baldwin should have personally checked the gun. And Baldwin says this: "People said to me, I got countless people online saying, 'You idiot, you never point a gun at someone.' Well, unless you're told it's empty and it's the director of photography who's instructing you on the angle for a shot we're going to do, and she and I had this thing in common where we both thought it was empty and it wasn't. And that's not her responsibility. That's not my responsibility. Whose responsibility it is remains to be seen." That quote right there tells you everything about what this interview is about. It is about shifting the blame. I believe a lot of what he's saying here. I believe his description of events. I believe that he is grieving about the death of his friend. I also believe that he wants to push the blame for this because he's seen even people in the industry, in Hollywood, turning against him. He wants to shift responsibility to anybody else. Stephanopoulos then asks him, "But there are some who say you're never supposed to point a gun at anyone on set, no matter what." And Baldwin says, "Unless the person is the cinematographer who's directing me to point the gun for her camera angle, that's exactly what happened. That day, I did exactly what I've done every day on that movie." So right there, not only is he trying to shift the blame, but he kind of blamed the woman he shot for telling him what to do, and he did it, even though he didn't personally check the gun to see if it was actually cold. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the prop master. I can't remember her name. She's like 24 years old, and she's only ever worked on one other movie. He did say in the interview that he never got the sense that she wasn't up to the job or that she wasn't qualified. He never got the sense that she was overworked or that there was any kind of a safety issue. But Baldwin talks about the prop masters, the armorers that he's worked with over the years, and he says this: "Sometimes they wouldn't demonstrate to me. Some insisted on demonstrating. They would do the demonstration for everybody right before we rolled camera or rehearsed. Then there were others, they didn't do that because I trusted them to do the job." And again, this is not me pointing a gun at somebody else, people pointing guns at me. I've been shot and killed in films before where people had to shoot a flash round at me because I trusted them to do their job. And in the 40 years I've been in this business, all the way up until that day, I never had a problem. And that right there tells you everything you need to know about this situation. And I think in those two statements, Baldwin did more harm than good in his case. He's trying to kind of reframe the narrative and shift blame away from himself. But I think he's done more harm than good with this. He claims that he's been pointing guns at people and had guns pointed at him for 40 years. and nothing ever happened negatively because he just trusted that the guns were safe based on what they told him. And in 40 years, he never checked for himself. That is the problem in a nutshell. Safety protocols, apparently, at least in the 40 years of his career, are non-existent. And people like Baldwin, who kind of, pull their hair out and gnash their teeth and scream and cry at the heavens whenever there's a mass shooting and they complain about guns, he hasn't taken the time in 40 years to do the bare minimum to ensure that the firearms that he's using are actually safe. And now it costs someone their life. All he had to do was take that one moment to confirm that the gun was safe. And I think it gets down to I think it gets down to not wanting to step on other people's toes or not wanting to embarrass other people. Like, oh, you say it's safe? Well, let me check behind you. I think it comes down to some of that. But when you're talking about a firearm, you can't let ego get in the way of safety. Baldwin says, quote, "You've had hundreds and hundreds of millions of bullets fired on the sets of films and TV shows, and 4 or 5 people get killed. Now, those deaths are tragic and abhorrent, and believe me, I would do anything in my power. I would do anything in my power to undo what was done. That I don't know how that bullet arrived in that gun, I don't know. But I'm all for doing anything that will take us to a place where this is less likely to happen again." Well, Alec, one thing you could actually do is follow basic safety rules and actually confirm the condition of the firearms yourself. You can't trust the people, the armorer or the first AD, to just hand you a gun and tell you it's safe. It's up to you. Now, when pressed on this matter, he had this excuse. Listen to this. Stephanopoulos says, "How do you respond to actors like George Clooney who say that every time they're handed a gun, they checked it themselves?" And Baldwin says, "Well, there are a lot of people who felt it necessary to contribute some comment to this situation, which really didn't help the situation at all. If your protocol is you check the gun every time, well, good for you. Good for you." What? "I probably handled weapons as much as any other actor in films with an average career. Again, shooting or being shot by someone. And in that time, I had a protocol, which was to do absolutely freaking nothing. And it never let me down." I had a protocol. My protocol was to trust everyone else with gun safety and not to take any responsibility at all. That was his protocol. Stephanopoulos says, "Well, why did you choose in your 40 years not to check the gun yourself?" Listen to this. "What I was taught by someone years ago, as I said, if I took a gun and popped a clip out of the gun or I manipulated the chamber of a gun, they would take the gun away from me and redo it. The prop person would say, 'Don't do that.' When I was young, they'd say, 'One thing you need to understand is we don't want the actor to be the last line of defense against a catastrophic breach of safety with the gun. My job,' they told me, man or woman, my job is to make sure the gun is safe, and then I hand the gun to you and declare it safe. The crew is not relying on you to check and see that it's safe. When that person who was charged with that job handed me the weapon, I trusted them and I never had a problem. Until now." Never had a problem until now. Sometimes it takes 40 years for stupidity to bite you in the ass. And that's what happened. This is the classic "I thought the gun was loaded" excuse that we hear all too often whenever there's a gun accident. So, for 40 years, he had prop masters, supposedly, he had prop masters and or maybe this happened on a set. He does say that when he was young, he had prop person say, "Don't do that. We don't want the actor to be the last line of defense." Why? If that's actually the attitude in Hollywood, that they don't want the actor to be the last line of defense, why would that be the case? Assuming that's correct, why would that be the case? Why would they not want one more line of defense? Armor, first AD, actor. Why would you not want the actor to be a part of that safety protocol so that they're free from any liability in case something does go wrong? Is that what that's about? Protecting the actor so that, well, it wasn't my job, and they can point the finger at somebody else? Why the hell would anybody in Hollywood take that job and hand a gun to a doofus like Alec Baldwin, knowing that if he screwed something up, if something was screwed up, he wouldn't check? It's beyond me. So the question Baldwin then keeps coming, repeatedly he comes back to this question: how did the bullet end up in the gun? Now, we were originally told this was a prop gun. That was what the news said originally. They used that term, prop gun. And we now know that it was not a prop gun. It was fully functional. It was a fully functional firearm, and it had been used for target practice by members of the cast and crew within days prior to the shooting. They'd actually gone out plinking with it. And we know that police discovered over 500 rounds of ammunition, a mix of blanks, dummy rounds, and live ammunition on the set. So they carelessly had different types of ammunition mixed together. Now, I'm not sure whether that's the case, but they did have live ammunition on set, which should never happen. So it seems a pretty good bet that a live round from that target practice session ended up still in the gun, and neither the armorer nor the AD actually confirmed that the gun was clear after they were finished. So for a live round to be in that gun when it was handed to Baldwin, the chain of custody failed multiple places. It failed 3 different places by my counting. The armorer failed to check the gun. Now, I don't know whether the armorer was involved in the target practice, but let's say the armorer was not. Somebody whoever took the gun out target practicing didn't clear the gun when they were finished. That's my guess. The armorer failed to check the gun. The armorer failed to demonstrate that the gun was cold when it was handed to the first AD. The first AD failed to visually confirm that the gun was cold and probably took the armorer's word for it that, hey, the gun's cold. Okay. They didn't check. Then the first AD handed the gun to Baldwin without demonstrating that it was cold and just said, cold gun, here. Baldwin, when he accepted the gun, based on his 40-year-old craptastically unsafe gun handling protocol, failed to visually confirm that the gun was cold himself. And then he pointed the gun at somebody and pulled back the hammer on the revolver that had no transfer bar safety, and he let it drop, and the rest is history. He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't have to. He might as well have. This was just a monumental failure, a mass act of negligence all the way around. And whether you believe him and his grief or any of the things he says in this interview, it doesn't matter. He's still partly to blame for what happened. And he refuses to accept responsibility. He says he doesn't feel responsible for this incident. And he says at one point, I guess that's a tough question because the actor's responsibility going this day forward is very different than it was the day before. And now, first of all, I can't imagine that I'd ever do a movie that had a gun in it again. When you say, what's the actor's responsibility? The actor's responsibility is to do what the prop armorer tells them to do. Let me stop there. Let me stop right there. No. The actor's responsibility is to confirm that the gun is actually safe. That the gun is actually in the condition that the armorer told them it was in. You can't shirk the responsibility because the gun's in your hand. If you simply accept that somebody else tells you that the gun's safe and then you point the gun at somebody else, that's on you as much as it is on the armorer. The actor's responsibility is to do what the prop armorer tells them to do, and we did not have a problem until now. I understand, says Baldwin, there was an accidental discharge at one point on the set of a blank round, but we did not have a problem for me until that day. The issue with that is there's only one question to be resolved. Only one. Where did the live round come from? He still refuses to accept that he should have checked the gun and that it's his responsibility. And he still thinks it's his responsibility was simply to accept what he was told about the condition of the gun. He and the first AD and the armorer should all face criminal prosecution. Every single one of them. It's not murder, but it's negligence. Every single one of them. And to be quite honest, none of them should work in movies ever again. At least not the first AD, not the armorer. They should never work in movies, never be allowed anywhere near props ever again. And as I wrap this thing up, I still think we should be praying for our enemies like Alec Baldwin. But now I think we should be praying for him now that we've gotten past the initial grief stage and all of that. I think we should be praying for different reasons. I do believe he's grieving. I do believe that his tears and his emotions in that interview are real. I do believe that he's grieving over his friends, probably because deep down he does feel guilty and feels like he bears some responsibility for what happened. But unfortunately, rather than accepting his role in this tragedy, he's shifting the blame and he's trying to save his own ass. He's being inconvenienced by this tragedy. He wants it all to go away. And for other people to deal with that stuff, and so he can grieve in private. That the families, everybody can just sort of, they can all grieve and it'll all go away and everything will be better. But we can't do that because a life was lost, a mother was killed, a wife was killed, and he's responsible to some degree for that. So we should be praying for him that somehow he would see through his own narcissism and jackassery and finally admit that he made a mistake and that he bears some responsibility for Halyna Hutchins' death. We should pray that he would recognize that his denials and all this blame shifting are a disservice to the woman he claims to have been a friend. And we should pray that he repents and seeks forgiveness. Because even though he has wounded a friend and killed another, that those sins are covered by the blood of Christ. But based on this interview, I'm not going to be holding my breath and expecting that any of that realization will actually happen anytime soon. All right. So that's all for this week. That's all I've got. What's been on my mind since I heard about this interview and decided to sit down and watch it for myself. I hope you'll do the same, because I think you'll come away with a different opinion, different from what you might hear in reactions in the media, in the conservative and pro-gun media. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your comments. Please, if you do want to share your concerns, your thoughts, or if you think I'm completely off my rocker, visit the feedback page, armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voicemail, a voice message. I'd love to hear from you, hear what you think about this whole thing. And even if you disagree. Next week, I don't know what we're doing. Hopefully we'll be able to get together with Pastor Bennett. Got another end of the year online hangout coming up the weekend before Christmas, and then we'll probably be shutting it down for a couple of weeks. Probably going to be 1 or 2 more episodes this month, and then we'll be shutting it down until 2022. So thank you all for listening. Be sure to tune in again next week for another edition of Armed Lutheran Radio. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback, or a review on iTunes, and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.